the forest was quieter than it should have been that morning. No birds, no wind, only the crunch of dead leaves beneath the hikers' boots as they followed a forgotten trail through the Appalachian backcountry. Mist hung low over the ground, curling around tree roots like pale fingers reaching from the earth. Then they saw it, the cabin. A small, slanted structure, half swallowed by vines and time. The windows were fogged from the inside, the door chained shut with rusted links. One of them laughed nervously and said it looked like something out of an old folk tale, but the laughter didn't last long. When they finally pried the door open, the air inside was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of rot and damp wood. Furniture sat where it had been left decades ago, a single oil lamp on the table, a cradle in the corner. But it was the diary that changed everything, a tattered leather book resting beside the cradle, its first page marked with a name written in trembling ink, Elsie Mae Harker, 1942. At first, the entry seemed innocent, a lonely girl describing her days among the trees, her chores, her dreams of seeing the world beyond the valley. But as the pages turned, her words began to change. She wrote about the voices that came after dark, about the footsteps that stopped outside her door, and about how she was told that purity was God's will. The deeper they read, the more they realized this wasn't just a forgotten journal, it was a record of something monstrous. Elsie's words became frantic, her handwriting uneven, describing nights she couldn't remember and mornings when her stomach ached and her body felt different. She wrote that her grandfather told her she was chosen, that their family's blood was sacred, and that no one outside their line could understand. By the time the hikers reached the final page, they were shaking. It wasn't just fear, it was the feeling that something ancient had been disturbed, something that had waited too long in silence. Outside, the forest seemed to close in again, as if swallowing its secret whole once more. The morning had begun like any other for the group of hikers, 4 friends chasing the thrill of discovery in the Appalachian wilderness, armed with nothing but backpacks, flashlights, and curiosity. The woods around them stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of damp earth, twisted trees, and whispers that seemed to rise from the soil itself. They had followed an old trail, one that wasn't marked on any modern map but had been mentioned by a local in the nearby town. He warned them that the path led nowhere, that it was better left alone, but they took it as folklore, another piece of small-town superstition. Hours passed with no sign of civilization until the trees grew denser and the light began to fade into a pale, silvery haze. Then they saw it, a slanted roof half buried in foliage, its wood blackened with age, its chimney broken and leaning like a gravestone. The cabin looked as though it had been forgotten by time, swallowed by the forest around it. As they approached, the air seemed to shift. The woods grew still, eerily silent, as if every living thing had paused to watch them. The closer they came, the colder it felt. One of them reached the porch first, brushing away cobwebs that clung to the doorway like thin white veins. The front door was chained shut, padlocked with metal so corroded it flaked under his touch. A carved symbol was faintly visible on the wooden doorframe, a crude cross within a circle, and though none of them could identify it, the sight of it made their stomachs twist with unease. They hesitated, debating whether to turn back, but the thrill of discovery outweighed their fear. Using a crowbar, they broke the chain and pushed the door open, the hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something sweet and decayed. Dust hung in the sunlight that filtered through the cracked windows, swirling like pale ash. Every step stirred the silence, the floorboards groaning beneath their weight. The furniture was old but intact, covered in layers of dust as if untouched for decades. On a table rested a single oil lamp, a pitcher, and a wooden spoon. In the corner, beneath a moth-eaten quilt, sat a cradle, small and motionless. The hikers exchanged uneasy glances, each one feeling that they had stepped into someone's life that had ended abruptly. One of them whispered that the cabin didn't look abandoned, it looked paused. Then, as they explored further, they found the first real clue that this place was not just forgotten but deliberately left behind, a diary, its leather cover warped by age, lying open on a rocking chair as if waiting to be read, its presence radiating a quiet, inexplicable dread. The diary rested where time itself seemed to have stopped, its cover brittle and darkened by decades of neglect. The hikers gathered around it, hesitant at first, each aware that what they were about to read might not have been meant for any living eyes. The first page was smudged, the ink faded, but one name stood out in trembling, almost childlike handwriting, Elsie Mae Harker, 1942. There was something heartbreakingly human about that name written so carefully, as if she had taken great pride in owning it. The first few entries painted a picture of a quiet, isolated life in the woods. Elsie wrote about her chores, her love for the creek that ran behind the cabin, and the sound of owls that lulled her to sleep. Her tone was soft, innocent, and strangely accepting of her solitude. She mentioned her grandfather often, describing him as strict but caring, the kind of man who didn't talk much but always made sure she had food and warmth. But as the pages turned, her words began to darken, her thoughts unraveling like thread from a fraying seam. She started to write about things that didn't make sense, at least not at first, strange rules she had to follow, the way she wasn't allowed to speak to anyone who came near the woods, and how her grandfather would tell her that outsiders carry poison in their blood. The hikers exchanged glances as they read on, their excitement fading into a deep unease. The entries became more erratic, filled with descriptions of dreams that sounded more like memories, shadows standing outside her window, whispers calling her name at night, and footsteps moving through the cabin when she was supposed to be alone. She wrote that her grandfather sometimes locked her in her room for days, telling her it was to protect her from the sickness of the world. The handwriting shifted over time, becoming shaky and desperate, as though she was writing in the dark. She mentioned her mother only once, calling her a sleeping angel under the earth, and spoke of her grandfather praying by the fire every night, whispering words in a language she didn't understand. The final entry they read that night was dated months after the last, written with a trembling hand and blotched with what looked like tears. It spoke of how her grandfather said she had been chosen, that the blood must stay clean, and how she could no longer tell when she was dreaming and when she was awake. When they reached the last line, the room seemed to grow colder. It read, "He says the baby will keep us pure forever." The hikers closed the diary in silence, the weight of those words pressing down on them like the forest itself. As the hikers continued reading, the diary revealed a world far darker than they could have imagined, a world where innocence and fear were inseparably entwined. Elsie's early entries hinted at a life shaped by isolation, but it was only gradually that the rules governing her existence became clear. She wrote about strict routines imposed upon her by her family, rituals that seemed trivial at first, waking before dawn, keeping the cabin spotless, walking only along certain paths, but the subtleties carried a weight of control that was suffocating. She described how her grandfather would watch her every movement, how he measured her meals and inspected her hands and feet, as if to ensure that nothing foreign could enter her life. There was an obsessive attention to lineage, a constant repetition of phrases like, "Our blood is sacred," or, "No stranger must touch what is ours," which seemed at first like the ramblings of an old man, but soon took on the rhythm of an indoctrination shaping a young girl's entire perception of reality. In her entries, Elsie wrote of forbidden desires to leave, to see the towns beyond the mountains, to speak with children her own age. Each time she confessed these longings, she described the swift, almost ritualistic punishment that followed. Her grandfather would scold her, telling her she was tainted by thoughts of the outside world, and sometimes he would leave her alone for days, leaving only scraps of bread and a bucket of water. In these passages, the hikers noticed a tone of fear that undercut even the most mundane descriptions, a fear not just of punishment but of something deeper, a creeping sense that her family's rules were absolute, unchallengeable, and enforced by generations long past. Elsie's writing also revealed the intense psychological confusion she experienced as she grew older. She described the voices of her ancestors in her dreams, guiding her actions and warning her of outsiders, and she wrote that she sometimes saw faces in the shadows that resembled her own family members, though distorted, as if she were being watched not just by the living but by the dead. The hikers felt an almost suffocating dread as they read her words. The diary was more than a personal record, it was a map of control, manipulation, and the construction of a life built to isolate and dominate. Her descriptions of her grandfather's authority hinted at something far more sinister than simple overprotectiveness. There were references to nights when she felt compelled to obey commands she didn't fully understand, to perform tasks that blurred the lines between care and coercion. She wrote of her body changing in ways that frightened her, her stomach aching for reasons she could not comprehend, and the journal entries became increasingly fragmented, more urgent, more desperate, as though Elsie sensed that the secrets she had been forced to keep were moving toward a revelation that no one outside the forest would ever believe. As the hikers delved further into the diary, a chilling pattern began to emerge in Elsie's words, one that blurred the boundaries between childhood and the unnatural authority her grandfather held over her. She began to describe a presence that haunted the nights, a man who visited when the cabin was dark and the wind carried the scent of decaying leaves through the cracks in the walls. At first, she referred to him vaguely, as if trying to shield herself from the horror of acknowledging him directly. She wrote of footsteps pacing the floorboards outside her door, the creak of the rocking chair shifting in the corner, and a low, murmuring voice that whispered warnings, commands, and sometimes incomprehensible words in the dead of night. The hikers could feel the tension as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, each line of Elsie's writing radiating the fear she could not articulate fully. What made the entries truly unsettling was the way Elsie described the voice and presence as both terrifying and familiar. She would write, almost in disbelief, that sometimes she thought she recognized the tone, the cadence, the warmth that accompanied it. She described fleeting glimpses of a face in the shadows, features she couldn't quite place, but which seemed to echo the faces she knew from family portraits hanging in the cabin or seen in the photographs her grandfather kept hidden in drawers. The hikers sensed a pattern, a perverse familiarity threaded into the haunting. The figure that terrorized her nights was someone intimately connected to her life, someone whose power over her went beyond fear into a grotesque, unquestioned authority. As Elsie's entries progressed, the line between dream and reality began to dissolve. She wrote that she sometimes saw him sitting at the edge of her bed, and other times she awoke to find him already there, as if the night had folded in on itself to trap her in a waking nightmare. The diary revealed how her grandfather's presence was an omnipresent force, dominating her world even when he was not physically in the room. She described trembling under his gaze, feeling her thoughts and movements monitored, as though her own autonomy was suspended entirely in the oppressive gravity of his control. The hikers read passages in which Elsie's voice quavered with fear, confusion, and a warped sense of obligation, writing that she sometimes called out to him, hoping for comfort, yet recoiling in horror when he responded. She acknowledged the strangeness of her feelings, the mingling of trust and terror, of love and revulsion, and the hikers could not help but feel the weight of that twisted bond pressing through the pages. The diary, once an innocent chronicle of a young girl's life, had transformed into a record of psychological captivity and unspeakable coercion, revealing the horrifying intimacy between the victim and the figure who haunted her nights, a figure whose identity lurked too close to home to be anything but grotesque. As the diary continued, the narrative shifted into something far darker, a descent into confusion and horror that left the hikers gripping the edges of the table. Elsie's entries began to reveal changes in her body she could not explain, physical sensations that frightened her and made her question her own mind. She wrote of stomach pains, sudden nausea, and bouts of exhaustion so extreme that she could barely rise from her bed. At first, she assumed it was illness, perhaps a virus or food poisoning, but the symptoms persisted, growing more intense over weeks. Her words became fragmented, the handwriting more erratic, as if she were struggling to capture sensations too vast and incomprehensible to describe. She confessed to waking in the night drenched in sweat, her limbs trembling, unsure whether she was dreaming or living through some unnatural occurrence. Elsie's diary entries began to hint at the unthinkable, though she could not bring herself to say it outright. She wrote in vague terms about how her body felt different and how her grandfather's concern seemed excessive, almost ritualistic, though never elaborating in full detail. Her fear and shame were palpable in the text, a young girl grappling with experiences she could neither understand nor explain, feeling simultaneously isolated and trapped. She recorded moments of private panic, staring at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror of the cabin, seeing changes that made her recoil, sensing life growing inside her before she could even comprehend the mechanics of it. Her confusion was compounded by the manipulation and control exerted by her grandfather, who framed these bodily changes as part of a family destiny or sacred duty. He told her she had been chosen, that her body was carrying a blessing meant to protect their bloodline, but his words, laced with a sinister authority, did little to reassure her. Instead, they amplified her fear, forcing her to comply with instructions she did not understand and to internalize a sense of guilt and horror that would normally be unimaginable for someone so young. As the pages progressed, the diary revealed Elsie's attempts to reconcile her own innocence with the physical reality she was experiencing. She wrote about moments of denial, questioning whether her symptoms were real, whether she was somehow imagining them, and at times even blaming herself for thoughts and feelings that seemed foreign to her. Her writing became a mix of fear, bewilderment, and forced obedience, documenting the slow, terrifying realization that something irreversible was happening, a development she could neither resist nor explain, and one that bound her to a cycle of secrecy and oppression so profound that even the hikers, reading decades later, could feel the weight of its horror pressing down on them as if the cabin itself were alive with the memory of her suffering. As the diary entries unfolded, the hikers began to grasp the depth of the isolation that had defined Elsie's life, a seclusion that extended far beyond the physical walls of the cabin into a cultural and generational prison. Her words revealed that her family had lived in this forest for decades, perhaps even centuries, deliberately cutting themselves off from the outside world. They had no neighbors to speak of, no children from other families to play with, and no schools to attend. Every aspect of their existence revolved around maintaining a strict control over their bloodline, a lineage they described as sacred and pure. Elsie wrote of family gatherings that were few and formal, gatherings where the older generations emphasized obedience, secrecy, and the preservation of their ancestral ways. Outside influences were treated as dangerous, corrupting, and forbidden, and she often recorded the anxiety that accompanied even a fleeting encounter with travelers passing near the forest. The diary painted a portrait of a family obsessed with continuity, one that had engineered its own isolation to shield itself from what they perceived as the moral and genetic contamination of the world beyond the trees. Elsie described being taught from a young age that her role in the family was predetermined, that her body and her actions were part of a larger plan extending back through generations. Her grandfather, the most authoritative figure in her life, reinforced this worldview constantly, reminding her that to stray from the family's rules would be catastrophic, that outsiders were not only irrelevant but dangerous, and that the purity of their blood must be preserved at all costs. There was a sense in her writing that the family had developed its own internal logic, a warped moral code that prioritized survival of the line over the well-being of any individual. She also reflected on the absence of medical care, education, and social contact outside the family. Illnesses were treated with home remedies, children were taught only what the family elders deemed necessary, and any curiosity about the outside world was met with intimidation or punishment. The hikers felt a chill reading how deeply ingrained these practices were, realizing that the family's self-imposed exile was not merely physical but psychological, shaping every thought, fear, and desire that Elsie experienced. She seemed to oscillate between longing for freedom and ingrained obedience, a tension that permeated every page of the diary. What made the isolation particularly horrifying was its permanence and intentionality. The family had deliberately erased their existence from public records, leaving no trace in census data, school rosters, or medical histories. Elsie's words conveyed a sense of being trapped in a world carefully constructed to prevent discovery, a hidden society within the forest that had been preserved at the expense of its members' innocence, autonomy, and understanding of the outside world, leaving her to navigate the terrifying consequences of a lineage so insular that the natural boundaries between family, morality, and horror had long since blurred. As the hikers continued piecing together the story from Elsie's diary, they began to understand the extreme lengths to which her family had gone to erase themselves from the outside world. It wasn't just that they lived in isolation, it seemed as if they had actively vanished from every official record, leaving no trail that might link them to society. Census records contained no mention of their names, birth certificates were absent, school enrollment forms were non-existent, and even the smallest legal documents, deeds, tax filings, or marriage licenses, were impossible to trace. It was as though the family had deliberately erased every trace of their existence, hiding in plain sight within the dense Appalachian wilderness. Elsie's diary reflected the consequences of this erasure. She had grown up entirely under the watchful eyes of her family, with no outside influences to guide or protect her. She wrote of moments when she would hear other children laughing in the distance or see travelers passing along a faraway road, and she was filled with a mixture of longing and terror, knowing that such contact was forbidden and that any attempt to engage with outsiders would be met with severe consequences. The diary revealed that her family treated this absence from the world as a sacred practice. The preservation of their pure bloodline required not only physical seclusion but also a meticulous erasure of identity from history. Elsie wrote about being warned that outsiders could poison the line, and that any trace of their lives leaking into the public record could attract judgment or interference. In her writing, this manifested as a constant vigilance over her movements, a psychological enforcement of secrecy so intense that she could not even speak to anyone who passed near the forest without fear. Every letter she might have written, every thought she might have shared with a friend or teacher, was strictly forbidden. The hikers began to grasp the chilling implications of this erasure. Elsie's family had lived for generations as though they had no right to exist outside their own controlled environment, effectively creating a hidden society where the rules of the outside world no longer applied. Every aspect of life was monitored, controlled, and manipulated to ensure that the family's secrets remained buried, and the outside world had no knowledge of their existence. It was a system that perpetuated itself through fear, obedience, and isolation. Elsie's diary conveyed the psychological weight of this invisibility. She described feeling untethered from normal life, as if she belonged to a world that had no reflection outside the forest. There was no education, no healthcare, no community beyond her immediate family, and this absence left her vulnerable, confused, and entirely dependent on her grandfather's authority. The hikers realized that the family's deliberate erasure from records wasn't just a quirk of survival, it was an instrument of control, a methodical mechanism that allowed generations of twisted practices to remain hidden, leaving her trapped in a world where no one outside could ever intervene, question, or understand what was happening. The hikers' unease deepened when Elsie's diary led them to a hidden part of the cabin, a trapdoor concealed beneath a threadbare rug in the corner. She had described it in hushed tones, writing about a cellar that her grandfather forbade her to enter but whose secrets seemed impossible for her to resist documenting. When they pried open the heavy, rotting door, the smell hit them first, a pungent mix of mildew, decay, and something faintly metallic that made their stomachs churn. The narrow staircase descended into darkness, and as they shone their flashlights downward, they saw walls lined with shelves that held a macabre collection of items, jars filled with murky liquids, bundles of cloth wrapped around small, stiffened forms, and stacks of faded photographs. Each photo depicted children, some smiling faintly, others staring blankly at the camera with wide, unblinking eyes, their features strangely distorted as if altered by generations of genetic isolation. Each photograph had a single word scrawled beneath it, blessed. Elsie's diary explained that these photographs were part of a ritual record her grandfather maintained, a way to preserve the memory of each child born into their family. The jars and bundles were similarly catalogued, evidence of a morbid obsession with control over life and death. The hikers felt the weight of a sinister history pressing down on them, the cellar feeling alive with the echoes of forgotten voices. It was not just a storage space but a shrine to a family's twisted understanding of lineage, purity, and obligation. Elsie wrote of sneaking into the cellar in secret, drawn by curiosity, fear, and an unspoken compulsion to bear witness to what her grandfather considered sacred. She described trembling hands lifting photographs and peering into jars, seeing forms that made her stomach lurch, yet feeling that somehow, this grotesque archive was a confirmation of her own place in the family's design. The hikers were struck by the meticulous care with which everything had been arranged. Nothing appeared haphazard, each item, each photograph, each jar had a precise position, a deliberate purpose. Elsie's writing made it clear that her grandfather viewed these objects not simply as mementos but as instruments, tangible evidence of the family's continuity, and as reminders of the weight she carried even as a young girl. The idea that her life and body were not her own, but part of a generational project that had been carried out in secrecy, created a tension in her words that radiated like cold air from the pages. The cellar, the photographs, and the jars revealed the horrifying reality that Elsie's family had been documenting and controlling each generation with obsessive precision. Every item was a testament to the perverse logic of isolation, a chronicle of lives lived entirely within the confines of the forest and the family's rigid, oppressive rules. The hikers could feel that the weight of history was tangible here, pressing down like the earth itself, and that the cellar held not just objects but the accumulated fear, compliance, and tragedy of generations carefully hidden from the outside world, a world that would never understand or intervene in the horrors preserved below the cabin's floorboards. As the hikers pieced together the fragments of Elsie's diary with the unsettling evidence they had found, they began to realize that the horror of her story was far more than anecdotal, it had left tangible, verifiable traces. Local legends and scattered whispers of strange families in the mountains had always painted them as eccentric or reclusive, but historical records, sparse and incomplete, told a darker story. When one of the hikers began examining old maps, deeds, and surviving census records, they noticed a strange pattern. Entire generations seemed to vanish, names recurring in impossible sequences, children listed with the same surnames as their grandparents, yet no birth or death dates confirmed. This absence of documentation coincided chillingly with the photographs and notes Elsie had described in the cellar. It was as if the family had not only hidden physically in the woods but had systematically removed any trace of themselves from the public record, leaving only fragments for those who dared to look closely. The most disturbing confirmation came when skeletal remains were discovered in shallow graves hidden near the edge of the property. The hikers, guided by clues in the diary, had stumbled upon these remains while exploring the outskirts of the cabin. Bones were fragile and partially decomposed, yet recognizable as belonging to humans of varying ages. When authorities and forensic specialists later conducted DNA testing on the samples, the results were shocking. Patterns emerged that left no room for interpretation, multiple generations of extreme inbreeding, familial relationships tangled in ways that were almost impossible to describe, and a final revelation that mirrored the diary's darkest implication. The lineage was so restricted that the genetic links traced directly from grandfather to granddaughter in a manner that was both scientifically verifiable and morally horrifying. Elsie's pregnancy, once a series of cryptic entries filled with confusion and fear, suddenly became undeniable fact. The DNA analysis aligned with her account, confirming that her grandfather had fathered her child, a revelation that both validated her diary and exposed the grotesque reality of her family's obsessive insistence on bloodline purity. The hikers felt a wave of disbelief and revulsion as they considered the decades of secrecy, manipulation, and control required to maintain such an isolated, insular family. The documentation, photographs, and remains all pointed to a chilling truth: this was not folklore or exaggeration, but a methodically preserved, horrifying pattern carried out over generations in the hidden recesses of the Appalachian forest. The implications of these findings were almost unbearable. The hikers understood that Elsie's suffering had not been a singular aberration but the culmination of a lineage's obsession with preserving its bloodline at all costs. The combination of historical erasure, meticulous record-keeping, and genetic verification painted a complete picture of a family whose isolation and adherence to twisted principles had allowed such horrors to persist unchecked, hidden from society, until now. The diary, the cellar, and the DNA evidence all converged to make the impossible undeniable, leaving anyone who studied the case with a profound sense of dread at the consequences of secrecy, obsession, and the terrifying power of a family unbound by societal law or conscience. The hikers were already unsettled by the evidence, but the final entries of Elsie's diary and the surrounding clues suggested a presence that had not ended with her disappearance or death. Locals in the nearby town, when approached cautiously, spoke in hushed tones about people vanishing in the forest, of lights flickering in abandoned cabins, and of whispers carried on the wind that sounded like the voices of children long gone. One old man muttered that the Harker's curse never truly left, that anyone who tried to dig too deeply into their secrets risked being watched, followed, or worse. As the hikers pieced these stories together with the diary and the cellar, the sense of an ongoing, almost sentient presence grew. It was as if the family's obsession, fear, and twisted rituals had left a tangible residue on the forest itself, a lingering authority that extended beyond the physical bodies and into the very shadows and soil. The diary hinted at this residual power in subtle ways. Elsie wrote that even after moments of apparent freedom, she could feel eyes on her, hear the faintest creak of a floorboard that should have been empty, and sense a presence in the room even when the cabin appeared deserted. The hikers realized that her fears were not merely psychological but tied to a deeply entrenched system of surveillance, manipulation, and ritual that had been in place for generations. Each generation reinforced the rules and the terror, and even in the absence of living family members, the mechanisms of control seemed embedded into the structure of the cabin, the forest paths, and the hidden corners where no light penetrated. As they examined the property further, they discovered more signs that the family's influence extended outward. Items that had once belonged to them were scattered subtly in surrounding areas: rusted tools, fragments of clothing, and old photographs partially buried in undergrowth. It was as if the land itself had been marked, a silent warning to those who might intrude. The hikers could feel a creeping sense of being observed, each shadow a reminder that the Harker's legacy was not contained to the pages of a diary or the cellar below the cabin, but had seeped into the world around them. The final, horrifying realization came when one of the hikers failed to return from a short exploration of the nearby woods. Panic set in, but searching yielded no trace of him, only the sensation, almost tangible, of being guided away or hidden by forces beyond comprehension. The locals' warnings echoed in their minds: the family's curse, the obsessive preservation of bloodline and secrecy, had left a mark on the land that was still alive. It became clear that the story of Elsie, her pregnancy, and her grandfather's monstrous acts was not merely a historical curiosity or a tragic tale of inbreeding. It was a continuing legacy, a mystery hidden deep in the woods, waiting silently for anyone who dared to uncover it, and ensuring that the shadows of the past remained vigilant, omnipresent, and capable of exacting consequences on the living.